You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 287 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show for the 30-something time is Will Porter. He's a journalist who's written a lot on U.S. foreign policy and Mideast affairs. I'm sure almost all of you have heard an episode of his on this show because there's just been so many great stuff. And specifically, since I'm talking about Syria today, me and Will have had conversations about this war over the past year and a half now. And so I think when we talk about, we put really good shows together and a lot of information. And boy, do we have a big story to talk about today, Will. When Trump got elected, kind of the thing that we would joke about was that the great thing about a Trump presidency that you would never have in the Hillary presidency was that one day you could wake up and Donald Trump would have tweeted at like 2 a.m. We're coming home from Afghanistan. I'll meet all the troops in, Virginia or something tomorrow. And, we had, probably the closest equivalent to that actually happen. Trump declared victory over ISIS and said the troops are coming home. So Will, do you want to fill the audience in here on what all happened?
Sure. So just to run down some of the basic, facts of this, Trump declared victory over ISIS, I believe yesterday, and he announced the immediate withdrawal of all 2,000 or so U.S. ground troops. I believe the State Department personnel who are there are supposed to leave within a day. They're supposed to leave within 24 hours. But I've seen two conflicting figures actually for when the soldiers are actually supposed to leave the country. I think the New York Times reported 30 days, but then I also saw a range of 60 to 100 days in other media. But nonetheless, it's pretty immediate. That's within, the coming weeks and months they're supposed to be vacating. And actually, there's been a video circulating in Turkish media that's alleged to show a convoy of 150 U.S. trucks, military trucks, leaving Syria for Iraq. And so if that's a legitimate video, that might be the first sign that this is actually starting to happen, that perhaps maybe that was the State Department getting out of there. Now, private military contractors might actually remain in Syria, but a lot of the ones that are there now serve complete support roles for the actual military. So there might not even be any use for them after the withdrawal, so they might not even, stay there in any significant number. The move... Oh,
now,
go ahead.
Wait, just real quick, do we have any idea if these guys are actually coming home or just, heading over the Iraqi border and stationing over
I think
there?
actually the latter. You're right. I don't know if I said they're coming home, but I should have said that they're leaving Syria. That's the least we can say with certainty. Some of them may be coming home.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to know if maybe Donald Trump had tweeted they're all coming home or something like that.
He may have actually said that, but I'm not sure if, how he speaks very broadly and very sloppily sometimes. I don't know if it means they're coming home or just they're leaving that war zone. And so, they're now sort of in more safety. I'm not sure what he means by that. So that's something we'll have to figure out as we go on. However, the move to leave, the move to withdraw, it goes against advice from both the State Department and the Pentagon, who've both consistently urged this long-term presence in the country. And it's kind of the move has received a bunch of backlash from pretty much all corners of the American establishment. And so, depending on where you stand on the issues, it's either good or bad to you. However, the most common objection so far, I think, has been that ISIS hasn't been defeated. So, contrary to what the president said.
So, maybe Will, just real quickly, before we actually get into a little bit more of the meat of what the withdrawal is, can you just kind of lay out the battlefield, I guess, in eastern Syria, what territory the U.S. controls, and then, what the U.S. role there is and why it's important?
Yeah, sure. So in northeastern Syria right now, primarily the U.S. is backing something called the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, which is primarily a Kurdish group. And they're holding, they're responsible for holding a lot of the territory up in the northwest. And they actually control a pretty significant swath of that territory. The United States has a smaller presence down in the south by the Al-Tanaf garrison. And then in the sort of northwest of the country, you have a smattering. You have Syrian government forces pushing up there. You have rebels around Idlib, and then you have Turkish forces way up in the north. And so that's more on the western side of the country. But yes, in the north and the east, it's mostly U.S. proxies, the SDF, controlling that territory. And then in terms of the Islamic State, there's actually there's a couple small pockets active in central Syria, and then there's one way far to the east near the town of Abu Kamal on the Syrian-Iraqi border. And so in terms of ISIS's sort of like status in the country, the Pentagon, their most recent estimate puts about 14,000 ISIS fighters in Syria, or 14,500. And the UN estimate is kind of similar. They say 20 to 30,000 in both Iraq and Syria, and sort of maybe split roughly equally between the two countries. I've actually seen that UN report misreported, or that UN figure misreported in the Hill and other media outlets, who sort of omitted the Iraq part of that figure. They just say, 20 to 30,000 left in Syria. How could Trump leave? But regardless, ISIS is definitely not gone from Syria. I'm not really sure what number you'd have to have them at to consider them defeated, but I think, over 10,000 or, 14,000, 15,000, that's probably too high for the term to apply, the term defeated to apply to ISIS. And these relatively small ISIS pockets have actually held out way longer than it seems they should have been able to. So part of the problem here is the fact that there's been a division of attention among the, as I mentioned, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish proxy group the U.S. backs. Their attention has been divided up into around the Afrin district of Syria because of Turkish assaults on Kurds there. And so the SDF has sort of had to split itself between, defending Kurds against the Turkish attacks and the ISIS cleanup operation. So that's kind of slowed down the cleanup of these pockets. However, another major problem here, a major reason these pockets have remained, these ISIS pockets, is the United States' years-long refusal to cooperate with the Syrian government or the Russians or its Iranian allies. And so, over the summer of 2017, we talked a lot about on this show, the Syrian army making gains against the Islamic State, pushing them out of all kinds of territory and driving them eastward. However, there were a bunch of cases where the U.S. did everything in its power to screw that up and kind of stop these advances the Syrian government was making. And so on several occasions, Syrian fighters were bombed by American or American proxy forces as they advanced toward ISIS territory. And there was even a shoot-down of a Syrian jet, during that period. And during that same summer, the U.S. basically blocked the Syrian army from participating in the Operation to Liberate Raqqa, which is like ISIS's that used to be their so-called capital city. And so Syria, because of this American presence, because their refusal to cooperate with the Syrians, the country is sort of partitioned. It's like primarily the Syrians and the Russians and Iranians are on the western half, and the U.S. and its Kurdish proxies are on the east. And this certainly has sort of slowed down the progress against ISIS. If they would have cooperated, those pockets might not be there. And so,
right. If you're looking at a map real quick, it's the Euphrates River that splits the country pretty much down the middle.
Yeah, and that's
well, not down the middle, but that's the dividing line, and it's pretty clear. I think the only territory controlled by either side on the other side of the Euphrates River is the control of the SDF over Manbij.
Right, that sort of hangs over there. But yeah, that's sort of like the division line. There's sort of a de facto, not a literal partition, but in terms of who controls what parts of the country, there is a partition. And so ISIS isn't defeated, and I think these are some of the reasons why. That the lack of cooperation, and then the Kurds having, a divided attention.
And I just wanted to add a couple things. There was a recent article in the Washington Post. I don't know if you read it. I think it's titled like A Secret War in Syria or something like that. It was talking about the growing insurgency and opposition, particularly in Arab areas, of the U.S. control, U.S. proxy force controlled territory, in eastern Syria, kind of to the U.S. occupation there. The fact that Raqqa, really hadn't been rebuilt at all so far. And, there's also this, kind of number in the article that I thought was interesting, that it said that it's possible there's up to 4,000 U.S. troops in Syria, which is a higher number than I ever heard. And I think the official cap, that, the U.S. president is legally allowed to put in Syria was like 508 or something. And Obama blew past that. And Trump has only, kind of contributed to this since. And, I just want to add that, during this kind of U.S. troops stay in Syria, there have been some U.S. troops killed. And so this wasn't bloodless. Some of this was, there was like a helicopter crash. I know that killed, several, probably 6 or 7, different U.S. military personnel. And there's been some other attacks and situations, that have resulted in dead soldiers as well. And so, this isn't a bloodless occupation for the Americans.
Right, and that's right. And speaking to the sort of discontent in the U.S. controlled areas, a lot of these towns and villages are Arab ethnic towns and villages, and they don't really appreciate being dominated by Kurdish groups or Kurdish militias. And so it's also not costless just to sit there and maintain this occupation. It's sort of there's a lot of pressure boiling there. That's not a costless thing.
So, Will, the next thing I want to move on to, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but what is the actual status of ISIS in Syria? Because I think one of the big things that people are pointing to is that Trump, just declared victory over ISIS, and it's not actually
right.
true.
As I sort of explained a minute ago, there's a couple pockets of active ISIS fighters in central Syria and along the border near the town of Abu Kamal. And I sort of gave the reasons why those are still there, why those are still, why they've endured longer than we think they should have. But certainly no, there are 14,500 ISIS fighters, according to the Pentagon, still left in Syria. So they're not defeated, but there's, as I went over, there are some reasons why that's the case.
When I guess, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but when I look at a map, it seems almost impossible that there's 14,000 ISIS fighters left in Syria. I mean, I'm sure this, includes a few thousand in the active pockets within the Syrian government held territory in Syria, but still, I don't know. It just seems like there couldn't be more than a few thousand, around 5. And add to that, do you have any idea if Baghdadi is still in Syria or any of the ISIS leadership?
I know it's reported that Baghdadi is still alive. I'm not so sure if he's still in Syria. However, the sort of, as far as the numbers go, the figures, I've seen sort of conflations with these things where, family members are included in the tallies and then it gets reported as just fighters. And so that's like an easy, point of confusion. However, the Pentagon's own actual report, I forget what the specific Inspector General report maybe, it specifically said ISIS fighters there. So I don't know, I'm kind of curious about what that actually means. What defines a fighter? Is it someone just close to a militant, or does he have to be an active militant who, is actively fighting every day?
Yeah, that's definitely true, and I think it's getting more complicated as well, because there's also a few thousand people held by the Syrian Kurds that are either family members of ISIS or ISIS fighters who have surrendered that I think are foreigners. I think there's about 2,000, mostly family members that the Kurds can't get rid of. They can't ship them back to their home governments, and I'm pretty sure it would be an issue if they started killing them. So, there's a lot of complications here still, to be resolved.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm sure you remember the story. I think ABC News actually broke this story of this secret deal with the Kurds to evacuate like 1,000 ISIS fighters, or a large number of ISIS fighters out of Raqqa. And there's sort of all this politics of like, we don't necessarily want to hold these guys. We can't really execute them. We kind of just have to let them go. And it was sort of a risky move, because there was allegedly some high level ISIS intelligence official who made off there. And so that also kind of contributes to the enduring presence of these small little pockets. Is like, it's hard to deal with them.
So I want to move on now to the reaction, because this has been quite astounding to me, maybe even more shocking than Trump just deciding that we're going to leave Syria. And if you've listened to the past episodes of the show, I really thought we were staying there for a while. I mean, everything that was coming out of the State Department, out of the Defense Department was, and from Trump officials like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, that the U.S. was staying in Syria to counter ISIS, to counter Iran. Excuse me. It's so stupid. Now, this is an actual policy. Has shifted from just countering or taking out and defeating ISIS to also staying there that way, to make sure Iran doesn't gain influence over that portion of Syria, I guess was, the idea, or to maybe leverage, Iranian withdrawal from Syria, something like that. That this was actual stated policy by U.S. officials, and now we're just gone. So that was shocking enough. But the reaction, particularly from some senators, Will, do you want to go ahead and get into that? Senator Graham?
Yeah, sure. So I think Lindsey Graham has definitely been like the most vocal, or at least he's been the most quoted, in the media about his, his critique of this move. And he called it, an Obama-like mistake. And he's comparing it to there's this sort of like narrative in the Republican Party that says that Obama leaving Iraq has led to the rise of the Islamic State, which that's a myth we've sort of debunked in many episodes on this show. But Lindsey Graham, he's been very vocal. He's appeared numerous times in media. He's been quoted all over the place. And he also just signed this bipartisan letter with several other senators, with Marco Rubio, Joni Ernst, Tom Cotton, Angus King, and Jeanne Sheehan, urging Trump to stay in Syria. And so, yeah, this is sort of like a broad-based opposition to this move. It's kind of interesting to see even Democrat senators oppose it.
Yeah, and then, one thing I was disappointed about, just talking about Democrats real quick, is I haven't seen Tulsi Gabbard come out in support of this yet. And so maybe it was just the Google search rankings that are screwing that up, and I'm sorry for getting it wrong, but I looked on Twitter and everything, and I haven't seen like a statement in support of the president. There have been some senators coming out and different representatives in support of the president here. Will, why don't you get into that?
Yeah, so you had Rand Paul, you had Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, and I believe Mike Lee, who've come out in support for this withdrawal in varying degrees. So certainly it's not universal opposition to it within the Senate and other, in the House, but it seems sort of overwhelmingly that there is opposition to the move, unfortunately.
Right, and Rand Paul, I think the most enthusiastically so, even getting retweets from the president and everything. I think this is quite significant that you do have Rand Paul jumping on board here, because the initial narrative from the media is that the entire Senate opposes this and it's the worst thing ever. And having, not Senate leadership, but I think Rand Paul is widely seen as an important voice of the Senate. If you ask people from other states, what Senate names they recognize, my guess is that Rand Paul ranks ahead of a lot of the others. Maybe even somebody like Tom Cotton is a little bit less known than Rand Paul. And for him to come out and say that this is a great, terrific thing, I'm sure helps the Trump's move as far as, kind of in the legitimacy of the population, if that kind of thing makes sense.
Yeah, I think Rand sort of commands some level of respect as well. I've even seen like people on the other side, on progressive or liberal side, sort of say like, of the few people on the other side in the Senate, Rand is one that that I'm okay with. And so, yeah, hopefully that is meaningful. Hopefully that has some impact.
Well, I guess not unexpected, but always disappointing. The mainstream media take on this has been absolutely absurd. Pretty much blanket condemnation for everybody but select people on Fox News. And, just the attacks against us are so stupid. Not a single one of them can give any good reason for the U.S. staying in Syria other than the great Obama did the policy. And, they continue to have John Brennan on TV to talk about this. And, they don't portray it as this is Trump ending the war for Al-Qaeda that John Brennan started, but that's actually what this is. And nobody's going to ask John Brennan that question. But Rachel Maddow will say one of the stupidest things I've heard Rachel Maddow say, and I know that's quite a big statement, but she said that this is unsettling to the families of the soldiers deployed to Syria, that they're going to be removed from a dangerous situation. It's so absurd.
Yeah, I honestly just find that hard to believe. I almost think that couldn't be true. Who did she talk to who told her that they were unnerved by the fact their son or daughter was going to be pulled out of danger, at least to some relative degree? But yeah, I mean, this is why I think we designate the mainstream media the imperial press. They at every turn will, support war, and then they'll oppose any kind of end to it or any kind of peace or détente, as we see with Russia and North Korea and many other things. And so, yeah, you had Fox and Friends, tearing into this. Jake Tapper on CNN. It was all over MSNBC with, John Brennan, Al-Qaeda's arms procurer in Syria. He came out against it, of course. Most mainstream outlets, I think, both in print and broadcast, came out against this thing in one way or another. Whether they, had opinion pieces or editorials, or even just sort of slanted news reporting, which often is the case. Like I mentioned with The Hill earlier, where they're slanting the figure to say that there are more fighters in Syria to make it seem like a worse idea to leave. That's just slanting your hard news reporting. And so, yeah, the whole mainstream media has sort of come out. They've had a reaction to this.
Well, and there's also been reaction from, and I think it's worth pointing out, celebrities are coming out against this. Well, I thought hippie Hollywood opposed the wars. And here they are, Trump bringing people home, ending the American occupation of a Muslim country where we are the occupying, oppressing force in some of these Arab territories. And ending this is apparently very offensive to even Hollywood celebrities.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the terms like virtue signaling and Trump derangement syndrome and stuff. They get overused a lot, but honestly, it's hard to, I think they apply in this case. It's hard to avoid that. People purely opposing this move just because of the personnel, just because of the person involved in making the decision, not because of what the decision actually entails. And so that's just the worst kind of like opportunism. It's just pandering to, the immediate crowd, the immediate whims of the crowd.
Well, and last, we're also getting from the Bill Cristols, the Matt's Boots, and the rest of the, deep thinking neocons. I guess at least that's what they call themselves. Are all condemnation across the board.
Yeah, our favorite hard Wilsonians. Yeah, they've all been against it.
Will, don't you know how hard Matt's Boot worked to start this war? How dare Donald Trump ruin it?
How many tens of thousands of words he had to write to get this thing going? But yeah, John Bolton, one of the biggest or at least neocon fellow traveler, advocates of long-term occupation of Syria. He was said to be livid by some anonymous source. And so, I take great joy in that and him being really bothered by this.
Yeah. And, I guess one of the great things about this, and I think me and Will both agree that so long as, generally, even, the less fast-paced plan that U.S. troops are, the vast majority of U.S. troops withdraw from Syria in the next 120 days is a huge victory and something that we should all, first of all, applaud Donald Trump for, and secondly, all congratulate ourselves for being against this stupid, evil war. And it's over. You know what I mean? This is great. If we've actually possibly, stopped being at war with a country that we were once at war with and having U.S. troops deployed there and everything else. And so I loved Twitter yesterday. It was, probably my favorite Twitter day in a long time to get to watch Caitlin Johnstone and Dan McAdams and, tons of other great anti-war voices just stomp and mock these stupid warmongers like Matt's Boot. Caitlin Johnstone tweeting, look, the guy who's wrong about everything is telling you it's the wrong thing to leave, Syria. It's just, these perfect opportunities to really mock these people and, hopefully, devalue their opinion because they're always wrong.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is sort of like, I always caution over optimism, but this seems like unambiguously a great thing, a great move. We finally ended one of the 7 or 8 wars we've been waging since the Obama years.
Right. And I guess the great thing as far as we've seen so far is there's not really a deal to ruin this thing. And maybe this is where, we should take the conversation next, Will, and kind of the fallout is, Trump's not saying, well, I'm going to hand this territory over to Turkish control or Iraqi control or Saudi control. And it seems like this is just the United States saying our mission in Syria is done. We're leaving. It's over. It's time to go home. So, maybe start off first with, Assad, Russia, and Iran, kind of that pairing in the war. What do you see coming from them? How this impacts them and what we're looking at?
I think I have like a lot more questions than answers when it comes to all like the possible future moves of these other actors involved in Syria. But for your listeners especially, I think maybe these are just good things to keep in mind as they read about this more in the future. So when it comes to like the sort of, Assad, Russia, Iran bloc, who've sort of been the primary 3 allies, with a lot of militia allies as well, but the 3 allies combating the insurgency in Syria from both ISIS and from other rebels. So some of the questions I have regarding this bloc is I'm curious if they're going to try to move east and sort of fill in the space where the U.S. the U.S. used to be and pick up where the U.S. left off in this fight against these ISIS pockets. And sort of how is that going to work with where the Kurds currently are and the territory they currently, that they control. There's questions about whether Iran or Russia will also slow their involvement in this conflict, and whether Russia's going to still work with the Syrian government in this final push against the rebels in Idlib, which, are still an ongoing thorn in Assad's side. Now I know I've read reports that over in recent weeks, Russia's actually decreased its military flights over Syria by like over 90%. And that's compared to the level of activity at the war's peak. And so in Russia's air war, at least, seems to actually be winding down as well, in addition to the American withdrawal. So I'm kind of curious how Russia is going to, how involved they're going to remain in this conflict as it kind of winds down.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's like 3 or 4 places I see potential conflict here. to keep your eyes on. What happens at Al-Tanaf,
Yes.
that border crossing with Iraq? This is kind of an isolated area where the U.S., I don't think, is backing any Kurds there. This is all just Free Syrian Army forces. My guess is that they're probably going to relocate or leave, that this territory will be retaken by the Syrian government, but that's speculation. But they've even talked about deals like this happening in the past, so I had to imagine the U.S. is just leaving, that's the case. And I think this is an area where there's, as we'll talk about later, other coalition forces deployed. A couple other key areas. The first is, I think they're the Al Omar oil fields. They're right on the U.S. controlled side of the Euphrates River of the city of Deir ez-Zor, which I think has a pretty heavy Syrian military presence. It's near the territory that's still controlled by ISIS on the Euphrates River. And it's, I think, the most important and biggest oil fields in Syria. And I think the Kurds and the YPG are pretty overextended down there. I don't know how much. I know at one point they had to release a lot of Arab prisoners, and a lot of these guys were former ISIS fighters because they were starting to face an insurgency. And so I don't know how tight the Kurdish control is down there. And so these oil fields might end up changing hands. The Raqqa Dam is going to be a big move here. From my understanding, it's currently controlled by the Syrian Kurds, but again, without American forces and help, this is probably an overextension of Syrian Kurdish power. And for those of you Austrian economics out there, when you pop a bubble, there's gonna be a correction. And so if you remove the artificial U.S. support for the Syrian Kurds, there's a lot of territory that they now hold that they're just not going to be able to continue to hold. And so I would guess that those may be some potential hotspots. Also, I think there's that border town Tabik. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Maybe Will could help me out if he remembers there. That could potentially change hands.
I'm not sure what the pronunciation is on that border town. But the Kurds definitely are in a strange position here. They're sort of in a bind. Many sort of analysts in the West have criticized the withdrawal, Trump's withdrawal, because it sort of leaves those Kurdish proxies very vulnerable, and without the American air support and arms and stuff. But I just think that, the Kurdish alliance with the United States has always been temporary. The Kurds had to know that. The U.S. could not just stay there and arm them indefinitely. Even though that's sort of what a lot of American policymakers have been arguing and saying for a long time. It didn't seem that was even a plausible option, for an indefinite, alliance with the Kurds. And so it would seem to me that with the Kurds, it's pretty urgent that they strike a deal with the Syrians, with Bashar al-Assad. Not only to sort of insulate themselves perhaps from the Turks, who obviously are sort of raring to go to attack them, but also maybe to secure some level of autonomy in Syria and sort of, get some kind of gain out of this whole thing. Hopefully they, I'm sure they want to come out on top on this. I'm not really sure what the Kurdish willingness is to do that right now. I'm not sure what the level of readiness they have to make some grand bargain or deal with Assad. I know there have been attempts in the past to do that, but they didn't really, they fizzled out and came to nothing. However, now it seems that that's sort of been forced on them. That decision has been forced on them to figure this out.
Yeah, I don't have much else to add. I think you pretty much covered the Kurdish point well. And next is Turkey, who of course is, I would say, a growing regional power maybe. They certainly look to be extending more and more influence into Syria, not only with the actual Turkish invasion of Afrin, but also the Turkey proxy force, the Euphrates Shield Syrian rebels, which include Free Syrian Army fighters, combined with quite a few jihadist types that have taken Kurdish land on the west side of the Euphrates River there. So, Will, I guess, the big question mark is what Erdogan does.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's been some very harsh sort of threats that, Erdogan's about to march right in and, launch another assault on the Kurds up there in the north. Now, one sort of potential buffer, at least, for the Turkish assault, for the intensity of their assault, has been the American presence in, towns like Manbij. They're sort of limited in what they can do there. They're not going to level the whole place and risk killing American soldiers. Now, Erdogan has certainly threatened to do that in the past, but up till now they haven't done that. They haven't, quite taken that risk. However, now with the Americans out of the way, it's not so clear, what they're going to do. It's not clear if this is just bluster, these threats, or if this is really something they intend to do. And perhaps they've sort of worked it out with the Russians and Assad that they'll be allowed to. I'm not totally sure there.
Right. Well, I mean, Turkey has in recent weeks made some pretty big threats, putting forces on not only the border with Manbij, and the Euphrates River with the Euphrates Shield soldiers, but also just on the Syrian-Turkish border there. And there's even been some shelling across the border. I think in response to this, probably 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Operation Inherent Resolve Twitter account actually tweeted out that the U.S. was going to put some manned outposts along the border there, seemingly as like a buffer between the Turks and the Kurds. And so these threats are serious, and you had to imagine that the U.S. felt the need to put our soldiers there. That meant they felt it was at least possible that Turkey was going to go ahead and invade. I think Erdogan's a bit of a wild card as a regional actor. He's at times even asserted that Turkey should take control over Mosul post ISIS. So maybe Turkey does look to take a chunk of Syrian land. I don't, I know that there's a lot of Kurds there who would fight them, and it would probably be a pretty difficult occupation for them, especially because I think the YPG, the Syrian Kurds, are pretty well linked up with the Turkish Kurds and the PKK. And so I think Turkey could be getting more than they bargained for if they come in. I'm not even saying that they're going, go in and be able to, occupy Syrian Kurdish territory long term. I think if you look at like kind of the relationship the Syrian Kurds have retained with Assad, clearly to them, Assad is preferable to Turkey and Erdogan. I'm not sure if I have all that much else to say about Turkey. Just, they've threatened invasion in the past. The U.S. has taken action to try to prevent this, but without the U.S. there, seems like that might actually happen. Next, Israel. Anytime anything happens in the Middle East, you have to kind of hold your breath and hope Israel doesn't do something crazy, especially since, just the rule of politics here and how things work. You have Netanyahu, who's in the middle of I think, pretty significant corruption scandal right now. And so who knows, maybe he takes some bold action in Syria, or I know Israel has been supportive of Kurdish independence. I think that's more because Iran, Iraq, and Turkey and Syria hate it, but who knows? Yeah,
as far as Israel, I think Israeli policies going forward is going to have a lot to do with what Iran decides to do in Syria. If Iran decides to keep, to stick around there in whatever troop levels they have there currently, or whatever militias they currently back, then I could see Israel, continuing to intervene in Syria if they think they can use that presence as an excuse, or the presence of Shia militias that can be conflated with Iran as an excuse. And so, certainly Israel has intervened maybe hundreds of times, certainly over 100 times they bombed Syrian territory with the excuse of bombing Hezbollah, weapon shipments or whatever, Iranian drones. There's been a bunch of rationales. However, it was reported that Trump informed Benjamin Netanyahu about the withdrawal earlier this week, apparently. And so that it couldn't have come as a complete shock to the Israelis. They've had a couple days to mull it over.
Yeah, I do think Netanyahu might be a little upset that his man in the White House, John Bolton, wasn't able to keep this going. I think it's worth noting that Israel's policy seems to be to, keep this war going as long as possible. If Syrian forces are fighting Syria, I think from the current Israeli government's viewpoint, that's a good thing for Israel. And, this has been expressed by Michael Oren. And it's been a very long and very bloody civil war. And I guess, Israel just can't take the victory, I imagine, and would like the U.S. to stay and continue to occupy Syrian Kurdistan to be a thorn in the side of Assad and continue the potential for violence in Syria, and everybody's attention turned, kind of to that territory and that issue.
Yeah, it didn't appear to me, like when I was looking at the sort of the statements from Israeli officials, it didn't seem like there was a huge amount of alarm or anger or outcry. And I think that has something to do with the fact that, there was some forewarning given, and they kind of worked out how they're going to respond. I even saw one official saying something like, being quoted as saying, the Americans told us that they have other ways to make things happen in Syria other than being directly occupied there. And so that may suggest some other form of involvement in the country, either through Israel as a proxy or otherwise. I'm not sure what that meant.
All right. Well, I want to talk about the coalition in the UK and France real quick, but there are a couple other things I just generally want to mention happening that I think are probably play into Trump's decision here. Well, hopefully play into Trump's decision if he's paying enough attention, or I think we'll just probably have significant kind of impacts on what happens going forward. The first is that the U.S. approved a $3.5 billion sale of Patriot missile systems to Turkey. There's been a lot of debate going on between the U.S. and Turkey over Turkey wanting to purchase the S-400 missile system. These are both air defense systems. I think the S-400's comparison would more be the THAAD missile system than the Patriot missile system. But still, heavy priced missile interceptors and air defense systems here with the S-400 and the Patriot missile system. Russia says they're moving ahead with the delivery of the S-400s to Turkey. It'll be interesting to see moving forward if maybe Turkey rejects this. This has been a huge problem from NATO. They see the S-400 missile system being something that won't allow Turkey to be linked in with the rest of the NATO air defense radar and all this other kind of stuff. The U.S. has the Patriot missile systems up in Poland and a couple other places in Eastern Europe, and they want all this tied together. And so if Turkey has the S-400, this is going to be a problem. They're also concerned about the information that will be gained with Turkey possessing both the F-35 and the S-400. The way stealth fighters work now, there's no complete stealth anymore. If the computers are able to, figure out whatever little radar pattern the F-35s put out, then they'll be able to detect them on their missile systems. And so, this is a very complicated issue. And so I think that missile sale may have something to do with the decision here. There's also the talk of the extradition of Fatah Gulen, who is accused by Erdogan of being the mastermind of the 2016 coup d'etat attempt against him. And then the last thing I want to mention here is just that Russia, Iran, and Turkey are in the midst of completing this UN peace process for Syria. The kind of first step here is to come up with like a constitutional committee of 150 members, 50 being proposed by the Syrian rebels, 50 being proposed by the Assad government, and another 50 kind of independent actors. And so what Russia, Iran, and Turkey are trying to do is put together the list of the 50 independent actors, and these are the last people, and then this constitutional committee can kind of kick into gear. And so, this is a pretty important and significant step in the peace process if it happens. And so just things to keep our eyes on, I think, as we move forward.
I have a question for you, actually, Kyle. Regarding those talks, do you know what the Western and sort of American response to those was? Did we pan them and say like, oh, that's not gonna work? Or was there praise or support or participation even?
From my understanding, neither. I just Googled it up because, they don't put out a lot of negative news. Nobody from the Washington Post is writing this story. The U.S. doesn't respond to Russia, Iranian, and Turkish talks. I'm not quite sure. From my understanding, this would be a part of the U.S. process, which the West has continued to endorse. So it seems like it would be a matter of, Turkey, I guess, representing the Western side and putting together a list that would be accepted by the rest of the actors here, including the UN Security Council, I believe.
Right. Okay, I see.
All right. Well, I know you had a few things to say about, the other really significant wild card here is that there's not just U.S. forces. There's also French and British forces. So what's going on with those guys?
So as far as we know, there's really only a handful of these guys in Syria, these special operations forces of the French and the British. I think there's like a couple dozen British commandos that work alongside U.S. forces, and the same I think goes for French. However, I was trying to find like if the UK government had said anything about what it's going to do about its presence in Syria, and I could only find one quote from the Telegraph. So take it with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily corroborated. However, it does say it gets this from UK government sources. And so it says, quote, Britain will renew its commitment to airstrikes against ISIL in Syria and will not be withdrawing from the conflict. And you and I were kind of talking off air, skeptically about this, because like what, they're going to have 12 guys sitting in Raqqa, like doing what? I guess they could have laser pointers and designate airstrikes and stuff and do that kind of thing. But what are they? I don't know. It just seems bizarre that this small support force would be left without the main force it was supposed to support, you know?
Right. So, I think that about covers everything. Will, there's this new tweet from Donald Trump that I want to read just before we wrap up. So hard to believe that Lindsey Graham would be against saving soldiers' lives and billions of $3 signs. Why are we fighting our enemy, Syria, by staying and killing ISIS for them, Russia, Iran, and other locals? Time to focus on our country and bring the youth back home where they belong. So,
excellent.
Nothing there I could really disagree with. It has always kind of made sense to me that there are common enemies here between the U.S., Russia, Iran, and Assad, and those enemies are the jihadist types, and so let them kill them. It's not like, everybody kind of does the safe haven myth kind of crap where they're like, well, if the U.S. isn't there to fight ISIS, they're going to come back really strong. And it's like, no, the Kurds will kill them, the Syrians will kill them, the Russians will kill them, the Iranians will kill them, the Jordanians don't really like them. So, I don't think there's much hope for these ISIS guys going forward here, whether the U.S. is there to kill them or not. And as we've seen, the kind of U.S.-backed Kurdish forces are showing very little interest in ISIS right now. They're much more concerned about Turkey invasion.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to just add here to perhaps your listeners is like to be prepared for, bad news out of Syria. A lot of people, I think, a lot of forces are arrayed to try to look for all kinds of bad news after this withdrawal and blame it on the withdrawal. However, often that analysis is way oversimplified. There's more factors involved typically. However, yeah, just prepare yourself for that kind of deluge of like, oh my God, look at the disaster of Trump's policy, when that might not quite be true, like just don't expect a utopia to emerge in Syria immediately or something.
Well, as long as we have another couple minutes, I think it is worth saying that I think that the narrative is going to specifically be that Donald Trump is repeating the mistake of Barack Obama in 2011 by withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq, thus allowing the rise of ISIS to happen. And for a very detailed breakdown of this, let's go ahead, Will, and link to in the show notes page, episode 115 of Foreign Policy Focus, The Rise of ISIS, where Will goes through and meticulously breaks down how the rise of ISIS was not the cause at all of the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, but all the other kind of situations going on in Syria. And then, just real quick here, explain why this isn't going to be if there is an ISIS attack or, any new propaganda, maybe ISIS even drives a truck and blows it up somewhere.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of considerations here. There's things like, insurgent math. So the idea that the more people you kill, the more of them you create. Therefore, a perpetual occupation can never defeat these things, can never, overcome that. You also have the issue of there are many other regional actors equipped to deal with this. And so it's just, like when you've seen the result of long-term American occupations and you see the rise of militancy, you need to disrupt that pattern. You need to just get out and stop and call it quits at some point. And there, I think, again, are other regional actors equipped to deal with, any ISIS that pops up. As I explained, ISIS is not defeated. They're not gone. That militant group still remains. It still exists. However, I just think it's no longer America's responsibility to try to deal with this. We're illegally occupying Syria. The Syrian government doesn't want us there. And so, just everything, points against staying.
Right. And yeah, like I said, I think the regional actors will, be the main thing here. But who knows, Will, maybe in 8 years we're talking about how the U.S. decided to back a Sunni resistance to Iran in Iraq, and that blew back and created some new jihadist group in Syria. They took a whole bunch of territory from the Syrian government. Crazy shit happens. All right, well, let's wrap up here. I didn't say it in the beginning, but if anybody wants to find any of mine and Will's work, I think best place to go is probably libertarianinstitute.org. My daily news roundups there, the show notes and the show are there featured on the homepage. Most of the articles Will's written, I think, have ended up at some point on the Libertarian Institute. We both post there in the in the blog section. But other bits of his work have been published at consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com. His patreon.com is worth donating to. Will remind people what that is.
Patreon.com/WKP journalist. And again, I think I said this last episode, but recently I kind of revamped it and added some benefit tiers and stuff. And so maybe your listeners would like to go check that out. I'd very much appreciate it.
All right. Well, Will, thanks for coming back on the show, and I'll probably have you on again soon. And thanks everybody for listening.